On a Tuesday morning in January of 2024, a 70-year-old cattle farmer in central Missouri climbed into a tractor that was older than most of the fences on his property. The seat was patched with vinyl and foam from a truck upholstery shop in Sedalia. The fenders had rust holes covered with pop rivets and scrap sheet metal. The paint, what was left of it, had faded past any color you could name. It might have been red once. It might have been burgundy. Now, it was the color of a thing that had spent 4 decades outside in the weather, which is to say, it was the color of endurance, and nothing else. He turned the key. The engine fired on the first crank. It settled into a low, steady idle that sounded nothing like the engine the tractor was born with. Because the engine the tractor was born with had been dead for 21 years. The heart beating inside that Massey Ferguson chassis was a Case IH diesel, pulled from a wrecked tractor in a neighbor's machinery shed, bought for $2,400 cash, and installed by a man who had no formal training, no service manual, and no business attempting it. No one puts a Case IH engine in a Massey Ferguson tractor. The brands don't share parts. The mounts don't align. The electrical systems speak different languages. There is no adapter kit sold anywhere on Earth. There is no YouTube video. There is no mechanic in any dealership in any state who would look at those two machines and say, yes, this can be done. But in the spring of 2003, a man named Russell Hadley did it anyway. Not because he wanted to, not because he thought it was a good idea, because he had no other choice, because the work was waiting, and the money was gone, and the cattle didn't care what was wrong with the tractor. They needed to eat. This is not a story about a tractor. This is a story about a decision that never ended. And if you stay with me, I'll tell you what that decision cost, what it saved, and why a man who could barely afford diesel fuel ended up teaching a lesson that the richest equipment dealer in the county had to learn the hard way. But there's something else you should know before we go any further. There was a man in this county who laughed at Russell Hadley. Laughed loud, in public, in front of people who knew them both. And what happened between those two men would take years to unfold. Years of silence, years of pride, years of drought and debt and machinery breaking down in the heat. And when it finally came to a head, it didn't happen the way you'd expect. It happened at a fence, at an auction, on a cold afternoon, and the thing that passed between them wasn't anger. It was something much harder than anger. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to Missouri, back to 240 acres of mixed pasture and timber ground. Back to a man who learned early that metal was just metal, and that pride was something you couldn't afford when the work was waiting. Russell Hadley was born in 1954, 12 miles south of Blackwater, Missouri, on land his father had worked since before the war. The farm was 240 acres of rolling ground, part open pasture, part hardwood timber, with a creek running along the south boundary that flooded every spring and dried to a trickle every August. The soil was decent in the bottomland and thin on the ridges, and the fences were a patchwork of barbed wire and hedge posts that Russell's father had set by hand in the 1940s, back when a man's back was the cheapest tool on the place and the most reliable. His father raised Herefords, white-faced cattle with thick hides and calm dispositions, the kind of breed that could survive a Missouri winter on hay and stubbornness. He cut hay on shares for neighbors who didn't own their own equipment, trading his labor and his machinery for a portion of the crop. The work was never seasonal. Cattle don't stop eating because it's January. Fences don't stop breaking because you're tired. And hay doesn't cut itself because the temperature is 102, and the humidity makes the air feel like a wet blanket draped over everything. Russell grew up in that work the way a fence post grows into the ground. Slowly, permanently, without anyone noticing until it's too late to pull it out. His mechanical education came the way most things came on that farm, through necessity. His father didn't believe in dealer service. The nearest equipment dealer was 35 miles away in Warrensburg, and his father considered the drive a waste of fuel and the labor rates an insult to anyone who owned a set of wrenches. If something broke, you tore it down in the barn and rebuilt it with whatever parts you could find, afford, or fabricate from scrap steel and imagination. If the parts didn't exist, you made them. If the manual said it couldn't be done, that just meant the manual was written by someone who'd never been broke in February with cattle to feed. Russell learned to weld before he learned to drive. He was 13 the first time his father handed him a stick welder and pointed at a cracked implement frame and said, "Fix that." He burned through 2 rods before he laid a bead that held. His father inspected it, grunted, and walked away, which was as close to praise as the old man ever got. Russell learned to read a micrometer before he could read a balance sheet. He learned to feel the difference between a bearing that was wearing and one that had already worn. He learned the sound a hydraulic pump makes when the seals are going, a high, thin whine underneath the normal noise that most people never hear, but that Russell could pick out across a barnyard. And he learned, early and without ceremony, that brand loyalty was a luxury reserved for people who had money in the bank. His father told him once, standing over a transmission case they were rebuilding on a Saturday night, with a single trouble light hanging from a nail in the rafter, oil on their hands, coffee going cold on the workbench, "It doesn't matter what name is stamped on the metal, son. What matters is whether it turns when you need it to turn." Russell carried that sentence with him for the rest of his life. It became the lens through which he saw every machine, every repair, every decision about what to buy, and what to keep, and what to let go. It was his father's voice, and it never left him, even after his father was gone. In 1982, at 28 years old, Russell bought a Massey Ferguson 3680 from an estate sale near Boonville. The tractor had 890 hours on it, which meant the previous owner had either barely used it or had rolled the meter back. And Russell didn't care which because the engine ran clean, and the hydraulics worked, and the price was right. $11,200. He financed it over 4 years at 13.5% interest, which was the best rate available to a young farmer with no collateral except the cattle on his ground and the ground itself. The monthly payment was $287, and for 4 years, Russell wrote that check on the first of every month and put it in the mail and never missed once. Even the winter the calves came early, and he lost 3 to the cold and couldn't sell the rest for what they were worth. The Massey Ferguson was not his first choice. He had wanted a Case IH2294. He'd gone to the auction with a number in his head, a ceiling he would not go past, and the bidding on the Case IH blew past that number by $4,000, while Russell stood in the crowd with his hands in his pockets and watched someone else drive it away. So he bought the Massey Ferguson instead, and told himself it didn't matter. Work was work. Metal was metal. His father's voice said so, and for 20 years, the 3680 proved the old man right. It pulled a 6-foot rotary cutter through Osage orange thickets so dense that the branches scraped both sides of the tractor at once, the thorns screeching against the sheet metal like fingernails on a chalkboard. It loaded round bales onto flatbeds in July heat so thick you could see it shimmering off the hood in waves, the air smelling of cut grass and hot hydraulic fluid, and the sweet diesel exhaust that meant the engine was working hard and not complaining about it. It plowed snow from half a mile of gravel road every winter because the county didn't send their trucks down Russell's way until the main routes were cleared and the school buses could run. And by that time, Russell had already been up since 5, already fed the cattle, already scraped a path from the barn to the road with the Massey Ferguson's blade. The Perkins diesel engine inside it ran cold in December and hot in August. It burned oil at a rate of about a quart every 60 hours, which Russell considered acceptable. It started hard on mornings below zero, cranking over 4 or 5 times before it caught, the exhaust blowing white clouds into the dark. But it always caught. Always. Russell didn't treat the tractor like a showpiece. He changed the oil when the hour meter told him to, every 200 hours, without fail. He greased the fittings every 50 hours, crawling under the machine with a grease gun and hitting every zerk until clean grease pushed out around the seals. He didn't wash it. He didn't wax it. He didn't park it inside unless a thunderstorm was coming, and the hay elevator was still hooked to the PTO, because unhooking the elevator took 20 minutes and hooking it back up took 30. And those were 50 minutes Russell could spend doing something that actually mattered. The tractor lived outside, in the weather, in the sun and rain and snow and wind, like the cattle it served. It was a working machine on a working farm, and Russell treated it accordingly. By the late 1990s, the Massey Ferguson had become invisible in the way that reliable things become invisible. You don't notice the fence post until it breaks. You don't think about the well pump until it stops. And Russell didn't think about the tractor except when it needed oil or grease or a new filter. It was there every morning. It did what he asked. It was not the tractor he had wanted, but it was the tractor he had. And for Russell Hadley, those two things had long ago become the same thing. Until the fall of 2002, when a man named Garrett Mabry made sure Russell knew the difference. Garrett Mabry ran the biggest equipment dealership in the county. His showroom sat on the state highway just outside Blackwater, a long metal building with plate glass windows and a gravel lot full of new tractors and combines and implements lined up in rows like promises waiting to be signed. Garrett arranged financing through 3 different banks, pushed trade-ins on every customer who walked through the door, and had opinions about everything and everyone who farmed within 50 miles of his lot. He was 48 years old, tall, broad across the shoulders, with a handshake that always lasted 1 second longer than it needed to, as if he was holding on until he was sure you understood who was in charge. He wore pressed shirts and polished boots every day, even in mud season, and he had a way of looking at a man's equipment and making that man feel like he was being judged, because he was. Garrett had been selling equipment for 20 years. He'd built his business on volume and financing, buy new, trade often, keep the payments rolling. He made money on the sale, money on the trade-in, money on the financing, and money on the parts and service that came after. It was a system, and it worked. And Garrett had never once questioned whether it was good for the farmers who signed on the bottom line. It was good for Garrett. That was enough. Russell went to Garrett's dealership one afternoon in October of 2002 to buy a hydraulic hose. That was all he needed, a $40 part. He parked the Massey Ferguson in the lot, walked inside, and waited at the parts counter. Garrett was standing near the new tractor display, talking to 3 or 4 other farmers about a Case IH Maxim that had just come in. He was in the middle of a story about horsepower and loader capacity when he looked up and saw Russell. His eyes moved past Russell, through the plate glass window, to the Massey Ferguson sitting in the lot outside. The faded paint, the rust creeping along the fenders in long brown streaks, the seat that was held together with silver duct tape that had turned gray from sun and age. The tractor looked exactly like what it was, a 20-year-old machine that had been worked hard every day of its life and had never been pampered. Garrett stopped mid-sentence. He looked at the tractor, then at Russell, then back at the tractor, and then he said what he said. He didn't say it quietly. He didn't pull Russell aside. He said it the way a man says something when he wants the whole room to hear it, when the joke only works if everyone laughs. Russell, I honestly don't understand how you're still running that pile of scrap iron out there. Are you farming, or are you running a museum? One of these days that tractor is going to die on you right in the middle of a field, and you're going to lose a whole season sitting there waiting for a tow truck. And when that happens, don't come calling me. I sell equipment to serious farmers. The room went quiet for a beat. Then a few of the men near Garrett laughed. Not all of them. Not loud. But enough. Enough that Russell felt it settle behind his ribs. In the place where a man keeps the things that hurt, but that he'll never admit hurt. Russell picked up the hydraulic hose from the counter. He set 320s beside the register. He picked up his change and put it in his shirt pocket. And he walked out of the showroom without looking at Garrett, without looking at the men who had laughed, without saying a single word. He drove home with the windows down and the Massey Ferguson's Perkins engine drumming steadily behind him. And he didn't turn on the radio, and he didn't stop anywhere, and he didn't say anything to anyone until he got home and sat down at the kitchen table across from Marlene. Marlene Hadley was Russell's wife of 26 years. She worked 3 days a week at the feed store in Blackwater, behind the counter, taking orders, making change, remembering every customer's name and what they'd bought the last time they came in. She kept the books for the cattle operation at the kitchen table after supper, writing figures in a ledger with a mechanical pencil, because she didn't trust computers, and she didn't trust banks, and she trusted numbers only when she'd written them down herself. Marlene had a way of seeing through people that Russell had admired since the day he'd met her and had occasionally feared every day since. She could look at a man for 5 seconds and know whether he was lying, whether he was scared, whether he was about to do something smart or something stupid. She could read a room faster than most people could read a menu. Russell told her what Garrett had said. He told her about the laughter. Marlene set down the dish towel she was holding. She looked at him. Garrett Mabry makes his living selling new tractors to people who can't afford them, she said. He's laughing at you because you don't owe him money. Think about who should be laughing at who. Russell turned the coffee mug in his hands and looked out the kitchen window. The Massey Ferguson was parked in the yard, just visible in the last of the daylight, a dark shape against the darker tree line. It looked the way it always looked. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The kind of thing you'd drive past 1,000 times without seeing. He didn't forget what Garrett had said. He didn't forget the laughter. He didn't forget the way it felt to stand in a room full of people and be told that everything you'd built and everything you'd maintained and every morning you'd spent in that seat was worthless. He put it away. He filed it in the same place he filed every slight and every insult, and every time someone had looked at his equipment and judged him for it. He put it away. And he went back to work. He figured the Massey Ferguson would keep running, and Garrett Mabry would keep talking, and neither of those things would change. He was wrong about one of them. The crack appeared on February 19, 2003, during a cold snap that dropped nighttime temperatures to 11 degrees below zero. The kind of cold that makes fence wire sing when you touch it. The kind of cold that freezes the water in the cattle troughs overnight and puts a skin of ice on the pond so thick the cows stand on it in the morning and stare at you like they're wondering what happened to the world. Russell had been leaving the Massey Ferguson outside near the cattle shed because he was feeding hay twice a day and didn't want to waste 20 minutes pulling the tractor in and out of the barn each time. 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes at night, 40 minutes a day spent doing nothing but moving a machine back and forth. Russell didn't waste time. Time was the one thing on the farm that cost nothing and was worth everything. He'd drained the coolant before the cold snap hit. He'd opened the petcock on the bottom of the radiator and let the antifreeze run out into a 5-gallon bucket. He watched it drain. He thought he'd gotten every drop out of the system. He hadn't. There was coolant trapped in a low spot in the block, behind the freeze plug for the second cylinder, in a passage that didn't drain completely unless you pulled the plug itself. Russell didn't know that. The Perkins engine manual probably mentioned it somewhere. Russell had never read the manual. His father hadn't believed in manuals any more than he'd believed in dealer service. When Russell tried to start the engine on the morning of February 19th, it turned over twice and seized. The sound it made was the sound of metal surrendering, a grinding, catching, final sound that Russell felt in his teeth and in his stomach, and in the part of his brain that understood, before his conscious mind caught up, that something very bad had just happened. He pulled the dipstick. The oil looked like chocolate milk. Brown and white swirled together in a pattern that meant only one thing: coolant in the oil, water in the crankcase, a cracked block. He stood there in the cold for a long time, holding the dipstick, watching the milky oil drip off the end of it onto the frozen gravel. The cattle were bawling in the shed behind him, waiting for hay. The sun was just coming up, casting long shadows across the yard. His breath made clouds in the air. He knew what this meant before the mechanic confirmed it. Hank Probst drove out from Blackwater on a Wednesday. Hank was the town mechanic, a man in his 60s who'd been fixing engines since Eisenhower was in the White House. He had hands the size of dinner plates, and a voice like gravel being poured into a bucket, and he delivered bad news the way he did everything else. Standing up, looking you in the eye, without decoration or apology. Hank pulled the cylinder head, inspected the block with a flashlight and a mirror on a stick, and found Russell in the gravel driveway. "You've got a crack running from the freeze plug to the second cylinder," Hank said. His hands were still greasy from the inspection. He didn't wipe them. He never wiped his hands when he was talking to a customer, because clean hands on a mechanic meant the mechanic hadn't been working. "Block's done, Russell. It's not coming back. You need a full rebuild or a replacement engine. Rebuild runs $8,700. Used Perkins block, if I can even find one, maybe $5,400 plus labor. You're looking at 2 weeks minimum. 4 if the machine shop in Sedalia is backed up, and they're always backed up." Russell asked what a new tractor would cost. Hank shook his head slowly, the way a doctor shakes his head when the question is about money, and the answer is more than the patient has. Russell already knew. He'd been to the Case IH dealer in Knob Noster the previous fall, just to look, just to stand in the lot and run his hand along the fender of a new Maxim 110 and feel what new felt like. A Maxim with a loader ran $52,000. Used tractors in decent shape, the kind that wouldn't need a major repair for at least a few years, started at $28,000. He had $1,890 in savings. Marlene's job at the feed store brought in about $400 a month. Their daughter Linnea was a sophomore at the university, studying accounting, and the tuition wasn't much, but it wasn't nothing either. Their son Colton was 15, a sophomore in high school who had grown up feeding cattle from the passenger seat of the Massey Ferguson, and who could drive it better than most adults could drive a car. The cattle operation covered property taxes, feed, and fuel, but only if nothing broke. Only if every animal stayed healthy. Only if the hay held out. Only if the price of cattle at the sale barn didn't drop below what it cost to raise them. The margins were so thin you could see through them, and there was no room in those margins for an $8,700 engine rebuild. Something had broken, and the margins had disappeared. That night, Russell sat at the kitchen table across from Marlene. The house was quiet. Linnea was at school. Colton was in his room. Outside, the Massey Ferguson sat beside the cattle shed in the dark like a wounded animal. Engine cold, block cracked, 11,400 hours of faithful work locked inside a machine that would never turn over again. Russell thought about Garrett Mabry's words from 4 months ago. One of these days that tractor is going to die on you in the middle of a field. It had died. Not in a field, but close enough. And Garrett had been right. And that fact sat in Russell's stomach like a stone he couldn't swallow and couldn't spit out. He thought about calling Garrett, walking into that showroom and signing papers on a used tractor with payments he couldn't make, just so Garrett could smile and shake his hand and feel confirmed in everything he'd ever said. He would rather sell every cow on the place. "We could sell part of the herd," Marlene said, as if she'd heard him thinking. "Sell cattle to fix a tractor, so I can feed the cattle I didn't sell," Russell said. "That math doesn't close." "Then what?" Russell looked at his wife across the table. The kitchen light was the only light in the house. Marlene's face was half in shadow, half in the warm yellow glow of the bulb above the sink. She looked tired. She looked worried. She didn't look defeated. "I don't know yet," he said. Marlene reached across the table and put her hand over his. Her hand was warm. His was cold from standing outside in the yard, looking at the dead tractor, trying to think his way through a problem that didn't have a solution he could afford. "We'll figure it out," she said. "We always figure it out." Russell wanted to believe that. He closed his hand around hers and held on. He called Dale Fenton on March 2nd. Dale farmed 480 acres of cattle ground 3 miles west of Russell's place. He was 10 years younger than Russell, a big man with a big laugh and a habit of buying equipment at auction that he didn't always need. 2 years earlier, Dale had bought a Case YH5120 Maxim at a farm sale for parts. The tractor had rolled in a ditch during spring planting. The cab was crushed flat. The front axle was bent past any hope of straightening. But the engine, a 4-cylinder Case YH diesel with 2,100 hours on it, barely broken in by diesel standards, was untouched. Dale had pulled it with an engine hoist, set it on a wooden pallet in his machinery shed, and planned to sell it to someone who needed a replacement. 2 years later, the engine was still sitting on that pallet, covered with a tarp, waiting for a buyer who hadn't come. "2,400, Dale said when Russell called, "and you haul it yourself. I'm not delivering." Russell paused. He held the phone against his ear and looked out the kitchen window at the Massey Ferguson sitting dead in the yard. Then he asked the question that would change the next 21 years of his life. "Dale, would a Case IH engine fit in a Massey Ferguson tractor?" 3 full seconds of silence on the line. Russell could hear Dale breathing. Then Dale laughed. Not a mean laugh. Not a mocking laugh. The laugh of a man who's been asked something so unexpected that laughter is the only honest response. "Not without some convincing," Dale said. Russell borrowed a flatbed truck and an engine hoist from a friend who owed him a favor from a fence-building job the previous summer. He drove to Dale's place on March 8th, a Saturday, backed the truck up to the machinery shed, and spent an hour rigging the hoist and lifting the Case IH engine onto the truck bed. He strapped it down with 4 ratchet straps and drove home at 30 miles an hour with the hazard lights on, because 600 pounds of cast iron on a flatbed that wasn't rated for it deserved careful driving. He set the engine on the concrete pad behind his barn and stood there looking at it. For 3 days, he didn't touch it. He just looked. He walked around it. He measured the bolt patterns with a tape measure and wrote the numbers on a piece of cardboard with a carpenter's pencil. He crawled under the Massey Ferguson and measured the frame rails, the engine mounts, the bell housing bolt pattern, the distance from the firewall to the front crossmember. He compared every dimension, every angle, every measurement between the dead Perkins in the tractor and the live case 1H on the pallet. Nothing matched. The mounts were different widths. The bell housing used a different bolt pattern. The electrical connections were different. The cooling system ports were in different locations. The two engines had been designed by different engineers in different countries for different tractors, and they had about as much in common as a horse and a mule, which, Russell thought, was maybe more in common than most people realized. Because a mule works. A mule works when a horse quits. And what Russell needed was something that would work. The engines were close in size, close in horsepower. The PTO shaft could be adapted with a new coupling. The hydraulic pump could be relocated with new lines and fittings. The radiator could be connected with universal hoses. It wasn't impossible. It was just hard. Russell's father had been dead for 11 years. But that night, standing in the barn with a trouble light hanging from the same nail his father had driven into the rafter decades ago, the same bare bulb casting the same yellow circle of light on the same concrete floor, Russell heard the old man's voice as clearly as if he were standing at the workbench with his coffee and his greasy hands and his absolute certainty that any machine could be fixed if you were stubborn enough to keep trying. It doesn't matter what name is stamped on the metal. What matters is whether it turns when you need it to turn. On March 11th, Russell pulled the dead Perkins engine out of the Massey Ferguson. It took most of the day. He disconnected every hose, every wire, every bracket, every bolt. He rigged the engine hoist to the barn rafter, hooked the chains to the lifting eyes on top of the block, and pulled the engine straight up and out of the frame. He swung it over to a pallet and set it down. 600 pounds of dead iron that had given him 20 years and 11,400 hours and had finally, in the end, given out. On March 14th, he lowered the Case 1H engine into the Massey Ferguson's engine bay for the first time, just to see how it sat, just to see how much space there was, how much didn't fit, how much would need to be cut and welded and fabricated. He was committed. There was no going back. The tractor had no engine. The Case IH sat in the frame like a wrong word in a familiar sentence. And Russell Hadley stood over it with a welding torch, a set of hand tools, and $1,890 to his name. And there was a secret about that tractor. A secret Russell would keep for 14 months. Until the day a mechanic at a dealership 30 miles away opened the hood, looked inside, and stopped breathing. But that comes later. If you understand what it feels like to stand in front of a decision that nobody supports, nobody recommends, and nobody believes will work, but you know in your gut it's the only road still open, then you understand Russell Hadley in March of 2003. If this channel brings you stories like this, consider subscribing. There's no pressure, no urgency. Just know that what happens next is worth staying for. And I promise you, it is. The first challenge was the engine mounts. The Massey Ferguson's frame rails were spaced 28 inches apart. The Case IH engine was designed for frame rails spaced 26 inches apart. 2 inches. The width of a man's thumb. The distance between a tractor that could work and a $1,000 pile of mismatched parts. Russell cut 2 sections of half-inch steel plate from a piece of scrap he'd been saving in the back of the barn for years. He drilled new mounting holes using a template he'd traced onto a piece of cardboard, measuring 3 times before he drilled once. He clamped the steel plates to the Massey Ferguson's frame rails, tacked them in place with the stick welder, checked the alignment with a level, and a plumb line hung from the hood latch, adjusted, checked again, and then laid the final welds. Long, slow passes with the welding rod, the blue-white arc throwing shadows against the barn walls, sparks showering down onto the concrete floor and dying in little orange dots. He ground each weld smooth with an angle grinder. He checked alignment one more time. He torqued the mounting bolts to 110 foot-pounds with a torque wrench he'd borrowed from Hank Probst. And he painted every weld with rust-preventive primer, because his father had taught him that a weld you didn't protect was a weld you'd have to do again. It took 4 days. 4 days of measuring, cutting, welding, grinding, and checking. 4 days of working in a barn where the temperature was 38 degrees at 7 in the morning and maybe 45 by noon if the sun hit the south wall. Marlene brought coffee at 10 and soup at noon. She set them on the workbench beside the trouble light and walked back to the house without asking questions, without offering opinions, without saying anything except, once, on the third day, "Soup's there when you want it." The second challenge was the bell housing. The bell housing is the piece that connects the engine to the transmission. It's the handshake between power and motion. The Massey Ferguson's bell housing bolt pattern had 8 holes on a circle that was 14 3/4 inches in diameter. The Case IH engine used 10 holes on a circle that was 15.5 inches in diameter. You couldn't bolt one to the other any more than you could shake hands with a man who had 6 fingers. Russell drove to a salvage yard near Marshall, 70 miles round trip on back roads, and spent 4 hours walking through rows of dead tractors sunk into the mud. Rows of machines that had been someone's livelihood once, someone's investment, someone's morning routine. Now they were parts. And somewhere in those rows, Russell believed, was the part he needed. He found it in a wrecked Ford tractor near the back fence. Someone, years ago, had retrofitted the Ford with a different engine, and in doing so had fabricated a bell housing adapter plate, a steel disc with 2 bolt patterns drilled into it, one pattern for the original engine, one for the replacement. Someone else, somewhere else, at some other time, had faced the same problem Russell was facing now, and had solved it with a drill press and a piece of steel. Russell bought the adapter plate for $60. He brought it home and spent 2 days machining it on a friend's lathe in a shop 15 miles away, turning it down, boring new holes, adjusting the centering to fit the Case YH engine block. The work was precise and slow, 1/1000th of an inch at a time. Check the fit. Go back to the lathe. Take off a little more. Check again. The fit wasn't perfect. There was still a gap of a few thousandths on one side. But when Russell bolted it in place and torqued the bolts and checked the alignment of the transmission input shaft, everything turned. Nothing bound. Nothing scraped. It held. Russell decided that holding was enough. The third challenge was the cooling system. The Case IH radiator hose connections didn't match the Massey Ferguson radiator. Different diameters at the inlet and outlet. Different angles where the hoses left the engine. Russell used universal hose stock from the auto parts store in Blackwater, stainless steel hose clamps rated for high temperature, and a tube of silicone sealant designed for engines that ran at 220 degrees. He pressure tested the system 3 times. The first test leaked at the lower radiator connection. He tightened the clamp and tested again. The second test held for 20 minutes, then wept at the thermostat housing where the sealant hadn't cured fully. He resealed it, waited overnight, and tested a third time. It held at 15 pounds of pressure for an hour. He called it good. The fourth challenge was the wiring. The Massey Ferguson's electrical system used a voltage regulator built into the instrument panel. The Case IH engine used a different charging system entirely. Russell rewired the alternator output, bypassed the Massey Ferguson's original charging circuit, and installed a standalone voltage regulator he'd pulled 5 years earlier from a John Deere combine he'd bought at auction and parted out in his barn over the course of a winter. He labeled every wire with masking tape and a black marker. Every single connection. every splice, every ground. Because if something went wrong at 2 in the morning in December, with cattle bawling for hay and the temperature dropping and the wind cutting through his coveralls, he wanted to be able to open that hood and trace the problem without guessing. On the 12th day, Russell hit the wall. He'd bolted the bell housing adapter in place, connected the transmission, and was trying to align the PTO output shaft. The shaft wouldn't seat. The adapter plate, the one he'd machined so carefully on his friend's lathe, was off by 3/16ths of an inch. Not much. You could see daylight through the gap if you got down on your back and looked up with a flashlight. But 3/16ths was enough to bind the shaft, enough to make the coupling grind instead of turn, enough to mean the difference between a tractor that could work and two broken machines bolted together. Russell lay on his back on the cold concrete floor and looked up at the gap for a long time. The trouble light swung gently overhead. The barn was quiet except for the wind outside and the occasional sound of cattle shifting in the shed next door. He was 12 days into a job that no one had ever done, and he was 3/16ths of an inch from failure. He drove back to his friend's shop. He machined the adapter plate again. 1/1000th of an inch at a time. Check the fit. Back to the lathe. 1/1000th more. Check again. 5 hours. When he finally bolted it back in, the PTO shaft turned freely. But on the drive home from the machine shop that evening, Russell pulled over on the shoulder of the county road. He sat in the truck with the engine idling and the heater running, his hands resting on the wheel, and he stared through the windshield at a field of winter wheat that was just starting to green up in the March twilight. He thought about calling Hank Probst, asking Hank to find a used Perkins block somewhere, anywhere, borrowing money, going to the bank, taking out a loan, doing the thing that normal, sensible people did when a tractor broke down, doing the thing that Garrett Mabry would have recommended with a handshake and a smile and a payment book. Then he heard the other thing his father used to say, not the one about names on metal. The other one. The one his father had said when Russell was 16 years old and wanted to quit rebuilding a transmission at midnight on a school night, grease under his fingernails and algebra homework waiting on his desk. If you've started, you finish. Halfway is worse than not starting at all. Russell put the truck in gear and drove home. On April 9, 2003, 32 days after he'd pulled the dead Perkins engine out of the Massey Ferguson, Russell Hadley wiped his hands on a shop rag, climbed into the tractor seat, and put his hand on the key. He didn't turn it right away. He sat there for a moment. The barn was quiet. The morning light was coming through the open doors in long slanted bars that fell across the tractor's hood. He could smell diesel and welding slag and the ghost of all the coffee Marlene had brought him over the past month. He turned the key. The starter engaged. The engine turned over once, twice. On the second crank, the Case IH diesel fired. It ran rough for 30 seconds. The exhaust was dark. The idle was uneven, hunting up and down as the fuel system found its rhythm. Russell kept his right hand near the key, ready to shut it down if anything knocked or ground or seized. His left hand gripped the edge of the seat. Then the engine smoothed out. The idle dropped and steadied. The exhaust cleared from black to gray to nearly invisible. And the Massey Ferguson 3680 settled into a sound that Russell had never heard in 21 years of owning the tractor. A deeper note than the Perkins had ever produced. A different vibration through the frame, through the seat, through Russell's spine. A different heartbeat in a familiar body. Russell let it run for 20 minutes. He climbed down and walked around the tractor slowly, listening, watching, checking every connection, every hose, every wire. He looked for leaks and found none. He checked the oil pressure gauge. Steady. He checked the temperature gauge. It climbed slowly, steadily, to the middle of its range and stopped there and stayed. He walked to an overturned barrel beside the barn door and sat down. His hands were black with grease and engine oil and 32 days of work. His back ached. His knees ached. His shoulders felt like someone had been hammering on them. He sat on that barrel and he listened to the sound of an engine that did not belong in that tractor, running as smoothly and steadily as if it had been born there. Marlene appeared at the back door of the house, 40 yards across the yard. She stood on the concrete step with a dish towel in her hands, looking at her husband sitting on a barrel next to a tractor that was running for the first time in 7 weeks. She didn't cross the yard. She didn't say congratulations. She didn't ask how it sounded or whether it would hold. She nodded. Once. Slowly. The way you nod when something you believed in turns out to be true. Then she went inside. The next morning, Russell hitched the hay wagon to the Massey Ferguson and drove out to feed cattle. The tractor pulled without hesitation. The hydraulics responded. The PTO engaged and drove the feed auger. The transmission shifted clean through every gear. Everything that was supposed to turn, turned. Everything that was supposed to hold, held. Russell didn't tell anyone what he'd done. Not Dale, not Hank, not the men at the feed store or the co-op elevator or the cafe in town. It wasn't pride, and it wasn't secrecy. Nobody asked what engine was in his tractor, because nobody cared. Nobody looked under the hood of a Massey Ferguson 368, unless it was broken. And it wasn't broken anymore. For 14 months, the Massey Ferguson ran with its Case 1H heart, and nobody in the county knew except Russell and Marlene. 14 months of mornings. 14 months of starting the engine, feeding cattle, cutting hay, hauling equipment. 14 months of a secret sitting under the hood in plain sight. Then, in June of 2004, the secret came out. Russell brought the Massey Ferguson to the Case YH dealership in Knob Noster for a hydraulic hose replacement. A simple job. 30 minutes. He pulled into the service lot, walked inside, and handed the work order to the service writer behind the counter. The service writer, a young man in a clean polo shirt with the Case IH logo on the chest, took the paperwork, walked outside to tag the tractor, and stopped. He stood in the middle of the service lot, clipboard in one hand, pen in the other, staring at the tractor. Then he looked down at the work order. Then back at the tractor. Then he turned around and walked back inside. "Mr. Hadley?" "Yeah." "That vehicle in the lot. That's a Massey Ferguson." "It is. But the engine in it, that's one of ours." "It is." The service writer opened his mouth, closed it, and went to get the lead mechanic. Ray Jessup came out from the shop wiping his hands on a red shop rag, expecting a routine hose job on a routine tractor. He was in his 40s, lean, quiet, the kind of mechanic who listened to an engine the way a doctor listens to a chest, hearing things underneath the obvious sounds that told him what was really going on. Ray walked up to the Massey Ferguson, leaned into the engine compartment, and went very still. He stayed like that for 10 seconds. Then he whistled, long and low, a sound that came from deep in his chest, the sound a man makes when he sees something he has never seen before and isn't sure whether he's looking at brilliance or insanity. "Who did this work?" Ray asked, still looking into the engine compartment. "I did," Russell said. "All of it?" "All of it." "By yourself?" "By myself." Ray straightened up. He looked at Russell. He looked at the custom brackets welded to the frame rails, ground smooth, painted with primer. He looked at the bell housing adapter with its 2 bolt patterns. He looked at the voltage regulator, zip-tied to the inner fender with its masking tape labels on every wire. "Tell me about the mounts," he said. Russell told him. The 2-inch difference in rail spacing, the 1/2-inch steel plates, the torque specs, the primer. Bell housing? Russell told him about the salvage yard, the Ford tractor, the adapter plate, the machining, the 3/16 gap that almost ended everything. Cooling? Universal hose, stainless clamps, silicone sealant, 3 pressure tests. Electrical? Standalone voltage regulator from a John Deere combine, every wire labeled. Ray listened to all of it without interrupting. When Russell finished, Ray asked one question. "Does it work?" 14 months so far, Russell said. Ray nodded slowly. He looked at the engine one more time. Then he went back into the shop and did the hydraulic hose job. He didn't charge labor. When Russell came back to pick up the tractor 2 hours later, Phil Overland was waiting in the service lot. Phil was the service manager, a quiet man with gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around his neck. The kind of man who had seen most things that could be done to a tractor in his 15 years running the shop. He had not seen this. "I want you to know," Phil said, standing next to the Massey Ferguson with his hands in his pockets, "that we've never encountered anything like this. Not once, in all my years." "I figured," Russell said, "if the engine fails, we can't warranty the work. You understand that. There's no precedent for this, no paperwork, no coverage." "I understand." Phil looked at the engine compartment one more time. He took his glasses off and put them back on again. "But if you need parts," he said, "you come to us. Case IH parts for a Case IH engine. It doesn't matter to me what frame it's sitting in. That's our engine, and we'll support it." Russell shook Phil Overland's hand. It wasn't a transaction. It was a promise. From that day forward, Russell bought every engine part from the Case IH dealer in Knob Noster. Every filter, every belt, every injector, every gasket. He bought them at full retail price. He never asked for a discount. He never haggled. He never mentioned that he was running the engine in a competitor's chassis, and they never brought it up either. He paid his invoice on the day it was due, in cash, and Phil Overland wrote the receipt, and that was that. Nobody signed anything. Nobody wrote up a contract. But both sides kept the agreement for 20 years. And in Russell Hadley's world, where a handshake meant more than a signature, and a man's word was the only contract that mattered, that unspoken deal was worth more than any warranty ever printed. This is why I tell these stories. Not because of tractors or engines or hydraulic hoses. Because of the agreements nobody signs but both sides keep. Because of the handshakes that outlast the paperwork. If you're still here, you understand what I mean. A like or a share helps this channel reach people who need these stories. And there's more coming. Now, about Garrett Mabry, and about what happened next. Russell hadn't been back to Garrett's dealership since the afternoon in the showroom. He had no reason to go. He bought engine parts from Case IH. He got feed store supplies where Marlene worked. He had no dealings with Garrett, and Garrett had no dealings with him. Their worlds had separated, the way oil separates from water when you stop stirring. But in the spring of 2007, the worlds collided. Word had gotten around the county, because word always gets around in a place where everybody knows everybody's equipment, and most people know everybody's business. Someone told someone at the co-op elevator, who told someone at the cafe, who told someone at the feed store, who told someone at Garrett Mabry's showroom, that Russell Hadley was running a Case IH engine inside a Massey Ferguson tractor. The story grew in the telling, the way stories do. By the time it reached Garrett, it had become legend. On an afternoon in April of 2007, Russell was at the feed store in Blackwater, paying for mineral supplement for the cattle. Marlene was behind the counter. Two other customers were looking at salt blocks along the far wall. The bell above the door rang, and Garrett Mabry walked in. He hadn't come for feed. Garrett stood in the middle of the store, his voice carrying to every corner, and said, "I hear you stuffed a Case IH engine into that Massey Ferguson of yours, Russell. That's not a repair. That's a comedy act. You're running a Frankenstein machine out there on your pasture, and when it breaks in half, and it will break in half, don't expect anyone to stand behind it. Not Case IH, not Massey Ferguson, not a single dealer in this state." Russell set his jaw. He held Garrett's eyes for a moment, long enough to make sure Garrett knew he'd been heard. Then he picked up the bag of mineral, tucked the receipt into his shirt pocket, and walked past Garrett and out the door. After Russell left, Garrett stayed. He browsed shelves he had no intention of buying from, and he said, loud enough that Marlene behind the counter and the two customers along the wall could hear every syllable. "That man's been farming for 20 years on equipment that should have been junked a decade ago. Some people don't know when to quit pretending." Marlene stood behind the register with her hand resting on the counter. She looked at Garrett Mabry with an expression that only Russell would have recognized, the expression that meant she was holding back words that would have blistered paint. She held them. She rang up his purchase and made change without a word. That evening, after Colton was in his room and the house was quiet, Marlene told Russell the rest. What Garrett had said after Russell left. Every word. Russell sat at the kitchen table, turning his coffee mug in slow circles on the wood, looking at the ring of condensation it left behind. "You're not going to let him get to you," Marlene said. "No," Russell said, "but I'm going to remember it." Here is what Garrett Mabry did not know that evening in 2007. In 5 years, Garrett Mabry was going to need Russell Hadley. Not for parts, not for equipment, for something that couldn't be bought or financed or traded in. And the cost of what passed between them would not be measured in dollars. But we're not there yet. First, the injection pump. In August of 2007, on a Wednesday afternoon when the air smelled of cut hay and hot metal, and the cicadas were screaming in the tree line, the engine lost power while Russell was mowing pasture. It coughed twice and died. The silence that followed was disorienting. For 4 years, the Case IH engine had run without complaint, a constant presence, and its absence left a hole in the afternoon that Russell could almost feel against his skin. He tried to restart. The starter cranked. The engine didn't catch. He checked fuel flow. Clear. He bled the system. Nothing. He walked to the house and called the Case IH dealer. Ray Jessup drove out the next morning. He tested the injection pump with a pressure gauge and a timing light, and he leaned against the fender and crossed his arms. "Pump's done," Ray said. "New one runs 1840 plus labor." Russell exhaled slowly through his nose. He looked across the pasture at the cattle standing in the shade of an oak tree, tails switching at flies, waiting for the world to sort itself out. He didn't have 1840. He didn't have 900. Ray watched Russell's face. Then he walked to his truck and made a phone call. Russell stood in the yard, hands in his pockets, watching through the truck's rear window as Ray spoke, and listened and nodded. 20 minutes. Ray came back. "We've got a used pump," he said. "Came off a trade-in last month. 3,400 hours on it, but it tested clean. My boss says 620. You install it yourself, or we add labor on top." Russell installed the pump that evening, working under a trouble light until the mosquitoes drove him inside at 10 o'clock. His knuckles were scraped raw from working in tight spaces, and there was diesel fuel in a cut on his right hand that burned every time he flexed his fingers. The engine started on the first try. He drove to the dealer the following week and paid the $620 in cash, laying the bills on the counter one at a time. Phil Overland wrote the receipt. He didn't mention Massey Ferguson. He didn't mention Frankenstein. He handed Russell the paper and said, "Let us know if you need anything." Russell folded the receipt, put it in his wallet, and drove home. The agreement held. In November of 2011, Russell's son, Colton, came home from college for Thanksgiving. Colton was 23. He'd worked 2 years on a neighbor's cattle operation after high school before deciding that college was worth the drive to Springfield. He was studying agricultural business at Missouri State, learning about supply chains and profit margins and all the things that Russell had never studied but had somehow survived without. Colton had been away for 3 years, and when he walked out to the barn that Thanksgiving morning and saw the Massey Ferguson idling in the lot, the same tractor he'd ridden in since he was small enough to sit on Russell's lap, he stopped. He walked around the tractor. He opened the hood. He looked at the custom brackets, ground smooth, painted with primer that was starting to chip. He looked at the bell housing adapter with its 2 patterns of bolt holes. He looked at the alternator and the voltage regulator with its masking tape labels, the tape starting to yellow and curl at the edges after 8 years in engine heat. "Is that the same tractor?" he asked. "Same frame," Russell said. "Different engine." "Case IH?" Russell nodded. Colton stared into the engine compartment the way Ray Jessup had stared into it 7 years earlier. Like he was looking at something that shouldn't exist, but did. "Why didn't you just buy a Case IH tractor?" he asked. Russell shut the engine off. The sudden silence was loud. He leaned against the fender and crossed his arms. A cow bellowed somewhere down the hill, and another answered from the shed. "Because I didn't have the money for a Case IH tractor," Russell said, "but I had the money for a Case IH engine, and I had the time to make it fit." Colton looked at his father. "Does it run as good as a real one?" Russell met his son's eyes. "It runs," he said. Colton nodded. He closed the hood and walked back to the house for breakfast. But the question stayed. It hung between father and son like something you can smell but can't quite name. Something that would come back years later, louder and sharper, on a night when both of them were soaked through and too tired and too cold to measure their words. The summer of 2012 brought the worst drought Missouri had seen in 50 years. The pastures turned brown by the middle of June. Not the gold brown of dormant grass, but the gray brown of grass that has given up. The ponds dropped 3 feet. The creek along the south boundary of Russell's property, the creek that hadn't gone dry in anyone's memory, stopped flowing on the 4th of July. The ground cracked open in the fields in long, jagged lines, as if the earth itself were splitting apart from thirst. Russell sold 18 head of cattle in the 3rd week of July because hay had gone to $120 a round bale, and he couldn't justify feeding animals at a loss. 18 head. Animals he'd raised from calves, animals he knew by the markings on their faces. He loaded them on a trailer and watched them go down the gravel drive, dust rising behind the wheels in a cloud that hung in the still air for minutes after the truck disappeared around the curve. The Massey Ferguson ran every day that summer. It hauled water to the remaining cattle in a 500-gallon tank mounted on a flatbed trailer, making 2 trips a day to the pond that still had water, 1.5 miles each way. It pulled the rotary cutter through what was left of the pasture, knocking back cockleburs and ironweed before they could set seed. It moved equipment, pulled fence posts, loaded hay. The Case IH engine never overheated. Not once. Not in 102 degrees. Not pulling a loaded water tank up the hill from the pond in 2nd gear with the temperature gauge climbing. The needle would rise to the middle of its range and stop. Steady. Every time. And during that drought, while Russell was hauling water and selling cattle and holding on, Garrett Mabry's world, came apart. For 20 years, Garrett had been financing tractors and implements for every farmer in the county, pushing them to buy new, buy bigger, trade in every 3 years. He'd made good money. The house on the hill at the edge of town, the truck that was never more than 2 years old, the showroom always freshly painted, always full of inventory, always lit up at night like a promise. Then the drought came, and the farmers who had stretched to buy new equipment couldn't make their payments. The cash dried up like the creeks. Garrett's accounts receivable turned into accounts uncollectible. The manufacturer pulled his franchise for lack of volume. The bank that had financed his floor plan called in the note. By the end of 2012, Garrett Mabry had lost the dealership, the inventory, the truck, and the house on the hill. Everything he'd built over 20 years, built on the assumption that farmers would always buy new and always make payments, was gone. Dale Fenton stopped by Russell's place one afternoon in August. Dale was hauling water, too, same as everybody. He pulled into the yard in his truck, stepped out, and stood looking at the Massey Ferguson idling beside the barn. Dust on every surface, rust creeping along the fenders, the Case IH engine running smooth and quiet inside. "That thing's still running?" Dale said. "Every day," Russell said. "You ever think about replacing it?" "With what money?" Dale stood there with his hands in his pockets. He looked at his own tractor across the yard, sitting on its trailer. A Case IH Farmall 95 with a cab and air conditioning. 3 years of payments still to go. Air conditioning that worked perfectly inside a cab that cost him $400 a month, whether he turned the key or not. He got in his truck and drove home. The drought broke in October. The rain came back slowly, and then all at once, and the creek started running again, and the ponds filled, and the pastures recovered the way living things recover. Not all at once, in patches, in stages, in their own time. Russell didn't sell any more cattle. He didn't buy a new tractor. He kept doing what he'd always done, working, one morning at a time. Colton graduated in 2012 and spent the next 4 years figuring out what he wanted. He worked for a feed supplier, driving a delivery truck across 3 counties, learning the business from the ground level. In 2016, he came back to the farm. He'd married a woman named Beth, who taught 3rd grade at the elementary school in Blackwater. They had a baby daughter named Wren. Colton helped Russell with the cattle in the mornings and evenings, and in between, he thought about the future. He wanted to expand the herd, lease more pasture, modernize the equipment, build the operation into something that could support 2 families instead of barely supporting 1. He wanted to replace the Massey Ferguson. The argument came in November of 2016, after a long day of feeding cattle in freezing rain. The kind of rain that isn't quite cold enough to be sleet, but isn't warm enough to be anything but miserable. Russell and Colton stood in the barn, both soaked through to the skin, both shivering, boots caked with mud, hands raw from working gates, and hay rings in the wet cold. "We need a newer tractor," Colton said. His voice had the edge that comes from being cold and tired and saying something you've been holding back for weeks. "Something with a cab, something with heat, something that doesn't look like we found it in a salvage yard." "This one's reliable," Russell said. "Dad, it's a Massey Ferguson with a Case IH engine. It's 34 years old. The sheet metal is rusted through in 6 places. The seat is held together with duct tape. If we're trying to grow this into a real operation, we can't do it with a tractor that looks like this." "Why not?" "Because it's not professional. Because it breaks down. Because we need—" "When did it last break down?" Colton stopped. He thought about it. Rain dripped off the barn roof onto the gravel outside in a steady rhythm. The injection pump, he said. 2007. That's 9 years, Russell said. His voice was level, quiet. He never raised it. Not when he was angry, not when he was tired, not when his son was standing in front of him saying things that cut closer than Colton probably knew. 9 years without a breakdown. This tractor starts every single morning. It does the work. And it's paid for. Every dollar of it. He paused. The rain hammered on the barn roof. You want to take on $40,000 of debt for a cab and a radio and a heater. That's your decision. But I'm not signing my name to it. Colton didn't push. He stood there for a moment, water running off his jacket, and then he walked out of the barn and drove home to his wife and daughter. The Massey Ferguson idled in the rain behind him, doing what it always did. That night, Marlene said something to Russell in the kitchen that he wasn't expecting. "The boy's not wrong," she said. She was drying a plate, holding it in the towel with both hands, looking at it instead of at Russell. "But you're not wrong either." Russell leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. "I know," he said. "That's the problem." Marlene put the plate in the cabinet and closed the door carefully, the way she did everything. She was the only person alive who could see both sides of Russell Hadley, and she was wise enough not to stand on either one. In March of 2018, the head gasket failed. Russell was pulling a manure spreader across the south pasture on a cold morning when the engine started losing compression. White smoke poured from the exhaust in thick, billowing clouds that hung in the still air behind the tractor like flags. The temperature gauge climbed. Russell killed the engine immediately, climbed down, and stood in the half-frozen field listening to the ticking of hot metal cooling in the wind. He called the Case IH dealer. They sent Ray Jessup out the next day. Ray had been working on Russell's engine for 15 years. He knew every bolt, every hose, every wire. He diagnosed the problem in 20 minutes. "Head gasket's gone," Ray said. "Head has to come off. Needs inspection, probably resurfacing. New gasket, new head bolts, torqued to spec in 3 stages. $12.40 in parts and labor." "Can I do it myself?" Russell asked. Ray pulled off his cap and rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the engine. He looked at Russell. He'd been looking at this man and this engine for a decade and a half, and he'd long since stopped being surprised by what Russell Hadley could do with a set of wrenches and enough stubbornness. "Torque sequence is everything," Ray said. "Get it wrong, and you'll blow the gasket again in 6 months. 3 stages, specific pattern. Skip a step, and you're back where you started." "Then don't let me skip a step," Russell said. Ray sold him the gasket kit, the head bolts, and a calibrated torque wrench. Then he reached behind the seat of his truck and dug through a file box until he found a printed torque sequence chart from the Case IH service manual. "Follow this," he said, pressing the paper into Russell's hand. "Exactly. 3 stages. Don't improvise." Russell pulled the head over 2 days, working in the barn with the trouble light and a space heater that took the edge off the March cold without actually making anything warm. He cleaned the block surface with a razor blade and brake cleaner, 1 square inch at a time, the way his father had taught him to clean any surface that had to seal. He checked the head with a straight edge and a feeler gauge. Straight. No warping, no cracks. He laid the new gasket. He set the head. He torqued the bolts in 3 stages, following Ray's chart, checking each bolt twice, marking each one with a paint pen as he went so he wouldn't lose his place in the sequence. The engine started on the first crank. Ray called a week later. "How'd it go?" "Running fine," Russell said. "No smoke, no leaks." There was a pause on the line. Then Ray said, "You ever need a job? You call me. I mean that." In the fall of 2019, Russell attended a farm auction 10 miles north of Blackwater. He wasn't there to buy anything. He was there because the man selling out had been his father's friend, a man named Orville Schenk, who was 81 years old and couldn't run the place anymore. Orville's children had moved to the cities. His wife had died 2 years earlier. And now 40 years of one family's farming life was rolling through the sale ring on a cold Saturday afternoon. Tractors, implements, hand tools, shop equipment, livestock panels, a stock trailer, 2 pickup trucks, a riding mower. The accumulated weight of 4 decades of mornings and decisions and seasons and work, all of it reduced to lot numbers and opening bids. Russell stood at the fence along the sale ring and watched it go. One of the tractors was a Case YH512 Maxim. The same model year, the same configuration, as the tractor that had donated its engine to Russell's Massey Ferguson 16 years ago. Russell felt a pull in his chest when it rolled into the ring. The paint was faded. The tires were worn. It had 6,400 hours on the meter. But the engine ran smooth, and the hydraulics worked, and it was whole, complete, every part original, every system intact. The auctioneer opened at $12,000. Bidding climbed in $500 jumps. It stopped at $18,500. Russell watched a man he didn't recognize hand over a check and drive the Maxim onto a trailer. He thought about the engine in his own tractor. $2,400 from a neighbor's shed. 16 years of daily use. The tractor that engine had come from, had it not rolled in a ditch on a spring afternoon, might have been worth $18,000 sitting in this sale ring today. But it had rolled. And because it rolled, Dale Fenton had pulled the engine and set it on a pallet. And because Dale set it on a pallet, Russell Hadley had bought it. And because Russell bought it, he was still farming. He thought about the men who had bought new tractors in 2003, the papers they'd signed, the interest rates they'd carried, the payments they'd made in good years and bad years, in drought and plenty. He thought about Colton, who wanted a cab and heat and the quiet hum of modern equipment. Russell didn't blame his son. Not anymore. The world had moved forward. Farming had moved with it. You couldn't ask a young man to accept cold rain on his neck when warm cabs existed. But Russell's world had moved forward too. Just more slowly. Just more quietly. And the Massey Ferguson with the Case, I.H. Hart, had moved with him. One morning at a time, one season at a time, one decision at a time. And then Russell saw Garrett Mabry. Garrett was standing on the far side of the auction lot, near the back, away from the crowd. He was alone. Russell almost didn't recognize him. Garrett was thinner than the last time Russell had seen him, years ago. His shoulders, once broad and square, had rounded. His clothes hung loose on his frame. His boots were scuffed and dull. The leather cracked. Russell knew the story. Everyone in the county knew the story. The dealership closing in 2012. The house sold. The trucks repossessed. Garrett doing small repair work since then. Fixing lawn mowers, replacing belts on riding tractors, patching tires for people who used to buy new machines from him every 3 years. The kind of work that paid rent, but didn't pay for much else. Russell walked around the edge of the lot. He came up beside Garrett at the back fence. Neither of them spoke for a while. They stood side by side, 2 men who had once stood on opposite sides of a showroom counter, one laughing and one being laughed at, now watching other people's lives being sold in the cold. Garrett spoke first. His voice was different, smaller. The confidence that had once filled a room, the certainty that he knew better than everyone about everything, was gone. What was left sounded like something that had been carried a long distance and set down carefully. I hear your Frankenstein tractor is still running. Every day, Russell said. Garrett looked at the ground. He watched his own boot scuff a line in the gravel. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. I pushed debt on half the farmers in this county for 15 years, he said. Told every one of them to buy new, buy bigger, trade in every third year. I made good commissions doing it, lived well, and now most of them are gone. Lost their farms, lost their equipment, lost their savings. Everything. He stopped. The auctioneer's voice called out numbers in the ring behind them. A hay rake sold for $1,400. Somebody clapped. And you, Garrett said. He looked up at Russell. His eyes were red at the edges, and not from the wind. You with the tractor I called a pile of scrap iron. You with the engine I called a comedy act. You're still standing here, still farming, still running that same machine I said would break in half. Russell kept his eyes on the sale ring. He didn't interrupt. I'm sorry for what I said in the showroom, Garrett said. That day, in 2002. I'm sorry for every word of it. And I'm sorry for what I said in front of Marlene at the feed store. What I said about you, about her. He paused. He swallowed. That's not who I wanted to be. But it's who I was. Russell looked at Garrett Mabry. He looked at him for a long time. He looked at the man who had laughed at him in a room full of people. The man who had called his tractor scrap iron and his engine swap a comedy act. The man who had said, in front of Russell's wife, that Russell couldn't afford to buy a proper machine. He also looked at a man who had lost everything. A man standing at the back of an auction alone, in clothes that didn't fit the way they used to, doing work he would have sneered at a decade ago. A man who had finally run out of the confidence that had sustained him and found something harder and more honest underneath. Russell thought about his father, about the old man standing at the workbench on a Saturday night, rebuilding something broken because that was what you did. You fixed what you could. You didn't throw away what still worked. And you didn't measure a man by what he owned or what he'd lost. You measured him by what he did with what was left. Garrett, Russell said, you know how to work on equipment. Garrett blinked. I do. I've got a hydraulic pump that needs rebuilding. You available? Garrett stared at Russell. He stared the way a man stares when someone offers him something he knows he doesn't deserve and can't figure out why it's being offered. The auctioneer's voice faded. The crowd noise disappeared. There was nothing in the world except two men at a fence, and one of them extending something that had nothing to do with a hydraulic pump, and both of them knowing it. You're giving me work? Garrett said. I'm hiring a mechanic, Russell said. Yes or no? Garrett nodded. Once. Slowly. He didn't reach for Russell's hand. He just nodded and stepped back from the fence and walked away. If you know someone who needs to hear this story, share it. Sometimes the right words at the right moment change the way a person sees a decision they're about to make. I'll tell you the rest now. Garrett came to the farm the following week. He set up in Russell's barn under the same trouble light that had hung from the same nail for 40 years, and he rebuilt the hydraulic pump. He did good work. Careful, thorough, methodical work. The kind of work that showed he'd spent 20 years paying closer attention to the machines than anyone had realized, even while he was busy selling them. Russell paid him a fair rate. Not generous, not cheap, fair. The way Russell did everything. They didn't become friends. That's not how it works between two men who've been on opposite sides of a public humiliation. What they became was something else. Something that doesn't have a word in English, but that anyone who's lived in a small community understands. They became two men who could work in the same barn without pretending the past hadn't happened, and without allowing it to ruin what came next. Colton stopped asking about replacing the tractor. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way understanding usually happens, not through conversation or argument, through experience. In 2017, Colton financed his own truck. A good truck. New, four-wheel drive, heated leather seats, a payment book that stretched across 60 months. And for 60 months, Colton felt what it meant to owe. He felt it in January when the cattle market was soft. He felt it in July when the hay was thin. He felt it every single month. Because the payment didn't care about the weather or the market, or whether Colton had slept or hadn't slept, or whether anything else on the farm was working or broken. The payment just came. Steady. Relentless. Indifferent. The Massey Ferguson didn't owe anyone. It just ran. Colton understood that now. Not because Russell had sat him down and explained it. Not because they'd had another argument in the barn. Because Colton had lived it. He'd felt the weight of a payment book in his back pocket for 5 years, and he understood, finally, what his father had been trying to protect him from. On January 7, 2024, Russell Hadley turned 70 years old. The Massey Ferguson 3680 was 42. The Case IH engine inside it was 21, the same age as Russell's granddaughter Wren, who was studying veterinary medicine at Colorado State University. Linnea, Russell's daughter, had settled in Kansas City, where she worked in agricultural lending, helping young farmers find loan terms they could actually survive. She called every Sunday evening, and every Sunday evening she asked the same question. "Is the tractor still running, Dad?" And every Sunday evening, Russell gave the same answer. The tractor still started every morning. The engine still pulled without complaint. The custom brackets, ground smooth and painted with primer that had chipped and been repainted and chipped again, still held. The bell housing adapter, machined on a borrowed lathe from a part salvaged from a dead Ford tractor in a muddy yard, still held. The voltage regulator, pulled from a John Deere combine that Russell had parted out in 1998, still held. The masking tape labels on the wires had been replaced 3 times over the years, because tape doesn't last the way wire does, but the wires themselves were still connected exactly the way Russell had run them 32 days in a barn in March of 2003. 21 years. 7,665 mornings. And every single one of them, the key turned and the engine caught. Over those years, Russell had replaced the injection pump twice, the alternator once, the starter once. He'd rebuilt the hydraulic pump in 2020 with Garrett Mabry's help. He'd patched rust in the fenders with pop rivets and scrap sheet metal. He'd recovered the seat with vinyl from a truck upholstery shop in Sedalia, the same shop that had done the first repair years earlier. The total cost of keeping the Massey Ferguson alive for 21 years, starting with the $2,400 engine from Dale Fenton's shed, was $11,760. That was everything. Engine, parts, repairs, maintenance, all of it, over 2 full decades. A new Case IH tractor in 2003 would have cost $52,000. Used tractors Russell might have bought that year ranged from $28,000 to $35,000. The numbers told a story, but the numbers were never the story Russell thought about when he turned the key in the morning. The Massey Ferguson had become something more than a machine over those 21 years. It had become proof that a man could take 2 things that didn't belong together, that no manual said would fit, that no mechanic would have recommended, and make them work. Proof that the name on the hood mattered less than the hand on the wrench. Proof that what his father had said at the workbench all those years ago was true. It was also proof of something Russell carried more quietly, something he didn't talk about and didn't need to talk about. It was proof that he had been desperate once, desperate enough to cut steel and weld brackets, and rewire alternators in a cold barn because there was no other way forward. The tractor carried that memory the way it carried everything else, without complaint, without comment, steadily. Every time Russell climbed into that patched seat, he remembered. He remembered the chocolate milk oil on the dipstick. He remembered Hank Probst in the gravel driveway with bad news and greasy hands. He remembered Garrett's laughter in the showroom. He remembered Marlene's hand on his across the kitchen table, warm when his was cold. He remembered his father's voice coming from the rafter, and the trouble light, and the workbench, and 30 years of Saturday nights spent fixing what was broken. The tractor carried all of it. Russell still bought parts from the Case YH dealer in Knob Noster. Ray Jessup had retired the year before, but he stopped by the shop now and then to drink coffee and check on things. Phil Overland was still at the counter, still writing receipts in his careful handwriting, still honoring the agreement that had started with a whistle and a handshake in a service lot 20 years ago. Garrett Mabry was 65 now, still doing repair work around the county, slower than he used to be, quieter than anyone who'd known him in his showroom days would have believed. Sometimes Russell called him for the bigger jobs, and Garrett came to the farm and worked in the barn, and they stood side by side under the trouble light, two old men with wrenches, and they didn't say much because they didn't need to. Russell didn't know how much longer the Massey Ferguson would last. The frame was solid, but the rust was spreading in ways that couldn't be stopped with pop rivets and sheet metal forever. The hydraulics were getting tired, the pump whining at the top of its range in a way that Russell could hear, but that most people wouldn't notice. The transmission ground into second gear on cold mornings with a reluctance that sounded like age, like a body that needed a few minutes to remember how to move. Someday, something would fail that Russell couldn't fix, couldn't afford, couldn't find parts for. The tractor was 42 years old. It had been running on borrowed time since the morning the Perkins block cracked. Every morning the engine turned over was a morning that the odds said shouldn't have happened. But that morning had come again today. The key had turned. The engine had caught. And Russell Hadley would keep turning it every morning, until the morning came when it didn't. Because the Massey Ferguson with the Case IH heart was not a tractor anymore. It was a decision that had never ended, made by a man with nothing but a welding torch and a father's voice in his head, who took what the world gave him and made it enough. On a cold morning in central Missouri, with frost on the fenders and steam curling from the exhaust into a pale winter sky, the engine turned over and held. It didn't owe anyone. It just ran.